Thanks, Scott. So I want to begin with a story. It's of a wife who goes away on a romantic holiday with her husband to the lake, but instead of spending time with his wife, the husband gets up every morning to go fishing for half the day, excuse me, only to return about mid-afternoon to have a long nap. Well, after about 4 days, the wife is sick of this, and so she decides while he's napping, she'll take the boat out, and so she rows around the lake a bit to find a nice quiet place where she just sits back and reads her book. Well, after about a half hour, the water police stop by, and the officer says to the woman, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're in a no fishing area, and I'm going to have to fine you." And the woman says, "What are you talking about? I'm not fishing, I'm just sitting here reading." And the officer says, "Well, that may be so, ma'am, but I'm afraid you're in the vicinity and you have all the equipment you need for fishing." Fortunately, the woman was very intelligent and quick-witted, and she said, "Well, that's very well, but I'm going to have to accuse you of sexual assault and bring you up on charges." To which the police officer says, "What? I haven't even touched you." And the woman says, "Well, that may be so, but according to your own reasoning, you're in the vicinity and you have all the equipment necessary for sexual assault." Needless to say, the police officer promptly left her in peace. Well, our passage today is looking at the equipment we need to face life's harsh realities. The equipment we need to face life's harsh realities. So, like I said before, we're kicking off a new sermon series on Hebrews 11 to 13, which is really a continuation of our sermon series from third term last year of Hebrews 1 to 10. And if you recall, the context of the letter is very simple, all right? It's written to a group of Jewish Christians, Hebrew Christians, who are under enormous pressure from their culture to give up this new religion called Christianity and return to their roots in Judaism. And we saw just how bad that pressure was towards the end of chapter 10. So if you've got your Bibles open there, I just want to read verses 33 and 34. It says this, "You suffered along with those in prison and verse 33. "Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. Other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those who were in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property." Now, our culture does not treat Christians this badly, but it's on its way. You see, Aussie culture now thinks it's cool to label Christians with all those buzzwords like bigoted and homophobe and transphobe and oppressive, etc. And this is due in part to mistakes that the church have made in recent decades regarding some of those touchstone issues of Western society. And look, we need to own that as Christians. So we are in part reaping what we've sown. But the main reason Christianity is seen as the enemy these days is because modern Western society has grown to view traditional ethics, in particular traditional sexual ethics, as not just outdated or prudish anymore, but actually downright oppressive. You see, to even hint that sex before marriage is wrong or practicing homosexuality is wrong is condemned by our society, because it's actually questioning a person's right to define their own existence, which is, the number one thing in our society today. You see, Christian ethics are now seen as the enemy of true freedom and happiness and fulfillment. So Christian persecution is on the rise. And the question our passage today asks is, how are we going to face being seen as public enemies? Like, how are we going to endure when our culture is now starting to openly oppose us as Christians? Well, in Hebrews chapter 11, the author is giving the readers the equipment necessary to face this hostility. And that equipment is heroic faith. Heroic faith. You see, Hebrews 11 is a big, long list, a very famous list of Old Testament saints who showed incredible faith in the face of immense suffering and opposition. And here's the thing, if we can tap into the lessons of Hebrews 11, and it's going to take us 4 weeks to get through Hebrews 11, then we will be better equipped to face the kind of opposition that is becoming all too common in our society today. So the passage we're looking at today kicks off this exploration by defining what faith is. That's what we're looking at today, defining faith. And I've got 4 points today, one more than usual, to help us define faith, as you can see on your sermon outline. So we're going to begin by saying that faith is based on evidence, point 1. Faith comes from a right attitude, point 2. Faith leads to obedience, point 3. And then we're going to wrap up with our application, which is how to practice such faith, how to practice this kind of faith. But our goal for today is to look at and define the one piece of equipment that you and I need to help us endure hardship in this life. So let's dive in and look at defining faith. And our author begins by stating how Christian faith is not blind faith. Right? It's not believing something in spite of the evidence. And we see this in verse 1. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Now, Peter O'Brien, in his commentary on Hebrews, says that the word translated assurance there, or certain in the old NIV, means to validate something through evidence. All right? So that word assurance, it means to validate something through evidence. And here's the thing, you and I as humans cannot know anything 100%. We cannot prove anything 100%, all right? I cannot prove to you 100% that you and I are actually sitting here this morning. Maybe we're in the Matrix. Who knows, all right? You see, all we can do as humans is look at the evidence and make a judgment call. And this is what we do with everything in life. So I'll give you an example. How do you know that when you put your foot on the brake in the car, that the car is actually going to slow down? All right? You and I cannot know 100% for certain that that's going to happen because brake systems do fail. So what do? Well, we look at the reliability of the car company. We look at the design rules that that the government has put in place, and we look at our experience of the fact that, well, every other time I've driven my car, when I put my foot on the brake, it slows down. And so what we do is we make a judgment call and say, okay, my car is safe to drive. All right? Faith is making a judgment call based on the evidence, even though we cannot know anything for certain. And this is what we do when it comes to God as well. We look at the evidence and we make a judgment call. So we see this in verse 3. Read it with me. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So the word understand there in verse 3 in Greek means to think over or to reason. All right? So what he's saying is the fact that what is seen was not made out of what is visible, or in other words, the fact that the universe just popped into existence out of nothing makes zero sense if there's no God. Theologian William Lane Craig makes this case very strongly with what is called the cosmological argument. Now, he didn't come up with it, but he's done a lot of work on it in recent years. And the cosmological argument says that to believe that the universe just popped into existence with no prior matter, no prior properties, and no prior cause requires staggering faith. Right? And even if it were possible for that to happen, no one has ever witnessed it in their lifetime. All right? Have you ever been sitting in your living room one day and all of a sudden, poof, appears a horse out of nothing? Like it's never happened. But that's what you have to believe about the universe if you think there's no God. It requires a staggering amount of faith. When we understand, when we think over, when we reason about how the universe was made, the evidence overwhelmingly leans towards there being a designer behind it, a designer beyond our comprehension. So, the equipment we need, this is what we're looking at today, the equipment we need to endure life's harsh realities is faith. And the first thing the author teaches us about faith is that it is based on evidence. All right? The next thing the author says is that faith comes from a right attitude. We see this in verse 4. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. So the author is recalling the events of Genesis chapter 4. And they're events that led to the very tragic actions of Cain killing his brother Abel. But I just want to read to you 3 verses from Genesis chapter 4. So this is the story he's talking about. Genesis 4 verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour. So we've got 2 brothers here bringing offerings to the Lord. Now, we're not told how much they brought, suggesting they both brought the proper amount, all right? And their offerings were consistent with their income. So Cain was a farmer, so he brought grain. Abel was a shepherd, so he brought animals. But for some reason, God was not pleased with Cain. Now, let's just think about that for a second. Let's let that sink in for a second, all right? Cain brought his tithe, his offertory, to the Lord. And the Lord wasn't happy. Right? That's alarming in and of itself. But the big question is, why did God look with favour on Abel's offering and not on Cain's? Well, according to God's own words in Genesis 4, it was because Cain did not do well. Quote unquote. You did not do well. Now, the only thing the text suggests was the difference between the brothers was their heart. Cain had an angry heart. Actually says it in Genesis 4:6, why are you angry? Now, anger, as we know, comes from unmet expectations. Right? The reason we get angry with people or situations is because they're not meeting my expectations. And this is why Cain was angry. He brought his tithe with an expectation. And that expectation was that God would be pleased with him and presumably bless him. Now, what does this teach us? Well, it teaches, firstly, that our physical offertory that we give to church each week, whether we put it in the offertory box or just let it go through the direct debit, that's not actually what is important to God. You see, there might be a person who's giving like 25% of their income or more, but God is actually happier with a person giving only 10% of their income or less. Right? It's not what you give that's important to God. It's how you give it. Right? What matters is our attitude towards God. And our attitude comes down to a simple question. Do you see God as a giver or a taker? Do you see God as a giver or a taker? Because if you see God as a taker, who's just always wanting stuff from you, then you will always be bargaining with him. You will always be saying, all right, how much do I have to give? Tell me the bare minimum I have to give for you to give me what I want. So I'll go to church every week, Lord. I'll give 10% of my income to you, Lord, so long as you promise to bless my prayers with health, wealth, and prosperity. And this is one of the reasons why the prosperity movement is so dishonouring to God. It makes God out to be a taker, whom we have to bargain with in order to get anything from him. But if you see God as a giver, then everything changes, especially our giving. Right? We no longer feel we have to hold so much back just in case, because we know that God knows our situation and we know that God is generous. All right? Abel was not expecting his offertory to earn God's favour like Cain was. Abel already knew he had it. Abel's giving was an act of thankfulness for all that God had already done for him. So friends, if faith is the equipment we need to endure the waves that are going to be smashing us against the rocks, all right, then know that heroic faith stems from the right attitude. The third and final thing the author says to define faith is that faith leads to obedience. Have a look at verse 5. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. All right, so there are only two people in the Bible who did not experience the horrors of death. One was Elijah, who was taken up into heaven in... anyone know how he was taken up into heaven? Sorry? A rapture? No. Chariot of fire. The ordained minister got it wrong. It was a whirlwind. All right? There was a chariot of fire involved. 2 Kings 2, if you want to fact check me later. He was taken up into heaven with a whirlwind. The other person, Enoch, he's a guy that pops up in their genealogy in Genesis chapter 5. And we learn this. This is Genesis 5:24. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, for God took him. So Enoch's faith led him to walk with God, which the author of Hebrews interprets as he pleased God. All right? His faith led him to live a life that was pleasing to God. You and I can please God with our obedience. The flip side is that, according to our author, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Right? It doesn't matter how many grandmas you help across the street. It doesn't matter how many hours you put in, coaching kids soccer. Those actions cannot please God if you don't have faith. Now, why is that? It's because those actions are not coming from a place of thankfulness. Right? How can you be thankful to a God you don't believe in? His point is, a life of faith leads to a life of pleasing God. We see this again with Noah. Okay? God says to Noah, I want you to build a big boat. And Noah says, but I live in a desert, God. And God says, don't worry. The water is coming. And Noah says, okay. Even though he faced daily ridicule for building a boat some 300 miles from the nearest ocean, right, he still obeyed. And this is the author's point. A life of faith leads to a life of pleasing obedience, even if it looks ridiculous to do so. And that's the kind of faith that equips the Christian to stand firm when the waves of this world smash us against the rocks, all right? It is a faith that is based on evidence. It's not blind faith. It's a faith that comes from the right attitude, not a poor attitude towards God, and it is a faith that leads to obedience. The only question left to answer is, how can we live out this kind of faith? Right? How can we normal Christians, like we're not heroes, we're just normal run-of-the-mill Christians, all right? How can we practice the kind of faith that will help us endure a society that now sees Christians as enemies? Well, there are three things I'd like to share with us by way of application as we close. Three things that will help us practice this kind of faith, and they are to rest, to remember, and to resolve, all right? 3 R's, so you can remember them. Rest, remember, and resolve. So the first thing is to rest in the evidence. Right? One of the big arguments against Christianity is, I just don't believe it. But such claims are not based on the evidence. People who say that have not assessed the evidence. Right? Because the evidence for Jesus is undeniable. There is no historian alive today who has publicly claimed that Jesus didn't really walk this earth some 2,000 years ago and didn't really die on a cross under Pontius Pilate. No historian I know of today has said that. Right? The historical evidence for the existence of Jesus is undeniable. But so is the evidence for his resurrection from the dead. Right? I read an article this week from Newsweek. It is like a non-Christian publication. But a few years ago, it was looking at the resurrection. It's titled, if you want to look it up, Rethinking the Resurrection. And the article basically says that the origins of the Christian religion, where hundreds of Jews and Greeks just travelled the world proclaiming the resurrection of the dead and sometimes even dying for that message, cannot be explained other than the fact that these hundreds of Christians actually witnessed the risen Jesus. It's either that or they had a mass illusion all at the same time. And so here's the thing. When people say, I don't believe the New Testament because of the miracles or because of the resurrection, they need to understand they're not doing history anymore. They're actually doing faith. They're saying, I don't believe it, therefore I'm not going to believe it. But their faith stands against the evidence. All right? Heroic faith comes from resting in the evidence for our faith. So, that's rest. After rest comes remember. All right? We need to remind ourselves that our God is a giver. That our God is a giver. 2 Kings chapter 5 has a great passage about this. It's the story of Naaman, or Naaman, however you want to pronounce it. Naaman was the commander of the army of Syria, and he had leprosy, right? But he was told about a Jewish prophet named Elisha who could heal him. And so Naaman goes to Israel with a letter of recommendation from his king, a whole bunch of chariots and horses, and a huge amount of gold, silver, and expensive clothes. Now, why does he bring these things? Well, the letter of recommendation was his resume. Look at what I've done. The chariots and the soldiers were his power. Look at what I can do. And the riches were, of course, him saying, look at what I can give. Yet we're told that Elisha doesn't even go out to speak to Naaman. He tells his servant to go tell Naaman, all you need to do is go wash in the Jordan 7 times. And Naaman was furious. We read it. This is 2 Kings 5:11. But Naaman went away angry and said, look, I thought he'd surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord, his God, and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of leprosy. And so Naaman storms off in a huff. But we read 2 verses later, Naaman's servant went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more when he tells you wash and be cleansed? All right, this is one of the best illustrations of the gospel in the whole Bible. Because most people come to God with their resume. Look how good a person I am. They come to God with their accomplishments. Look what I can do for you, God, to earn my salvation. They come with their riches. Look what I can give you, God, to earn my salvation. And God says, I don't want any of that. Like, what can you possibly give an infinite being that I don't already have? Instead, I give you salvation for free. Heroic faith comes from remembering that God is not interested in taking from you. You have nothing he wants or needs. That's not in his nature to take. Our God is a giver. And thirdly, so rest, remember, resolve. Resolve to obey God, even if it looks stupid to do so. So I'll give you an example. Imagine your boss comes to you and asks you to do something illegal for your job. It's not a big crime. You'll almost certainly not get caught, but he wants you to do it, and he makes it clear that she makes it clear that your job is on the line. Right? Everything about the situation says it would be ridiculous for you not to do this little thing. Heroic faith will have the resolve to obey God and trust that even if your boss takes from you, God will use that situation to give you way more than your boss can take. And friends, if we cultivate this kind of faith, put this kind of faith into practice, then we have all the equipment we need to stand firm when wave after wave of opposition and persecution and just general hardship comes our way. And so when hard times come, and they will come, friends, you know that, may we be the kind of Christians who rest in the fact that our faith is not blind faith. It is based on rock-solid evidence. May we remember that our God is not out to get us or take from us. He's out to give. And may we resolve today to always obey God, even when it looks ridiculous to do so. For that is the kind of faith that helps us endure.